Well, I want to thank Scott for stealing my best lines before I started. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Partners for Change and the Oslo Human Rights Center for this great opportunity for me to contribute to their discussions advancing global peace and security. And they've come up with a winning formula: women. I also want to thank the country of Norway, who's lived up to its home for peacemakers by taking a leading role in the world in advancing international law, humanitarian aid, to end conflict and to promote equality. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize stands for advancing root causes of conflict, and one of those, of course, is the continuing gender disparity in power that leads to so many conflicts and leads to the kinds of brutal sexual violence that we see in conflicts. But I want to acknowledge that for the first time in history, the Nobel Peace Prize has gone to a woman, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Prior to this, there have been 85 men and 14 women, I believe, getting the Nobel Peace Prize, but no woman ever became head of state either before or after the Peace Prize. Women sort of hit a power ceiling. They were empowered, but not in power. We'd like to see this trend continue. Aung San Suu Kyi, we'd like to see be head of Burma. Shirin Ebadi should be head of Iran. Now, think of the geopolitical discussions that would go on should that happen tomorrow. But it's not going to happen tomorrow because the constitutional power in Burma is the commander-in-chief of the defense forces under the Constitution. That position is explicitly forbidden to women. The power in Iran is the Ayatollah. The position is explicitly forbidden to women. So we have a long ways to go to making empowered women that we see all around us into power. And I welcome the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi is going to run for parliament. But I think we have to remember she can't run for president. Even though it's a titular position, she doesn't have military experience, and she's been married to a foreigner. Both things were written in the Constitution to disqualify her from the office that she so rightfully should occupy and was once elected to. Now, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, in her speech in Oslo, said that one sign of hope in the world, and there are many, is international law and the awareness of human rights. So my remarks are directed at the role of international law as a tool. And I'm not for change, I'm for radical change. I want to see international laws really enforced, because if they were, the world would look completely differently. Enforcing international law can mean radically reshaping what we think of as democracy. Right now, democracy is measured by free speech. We talk about democracy in Burma because we see free speech. Democracy is seen by an open election. But those two things shouldn't be the defining factors of democracy alone. Democracy should look at de facto gender equality in all power positions, including half of the judiciaries. I work with transitional democracies. There have been about 30 new countries in the last 15 years, and you get a new president, you get a new constitution, you get a new legislature, you get a new parliament, you get new laws. But you have the same old judges with the same mindsets, and they're men, and that has to change for laws to take effect that really ensure equality. Now, I see law as a tool to power. You know, I think about the issue that in Saudi Arabia women can't drive. Well, that's probably not as important of a women's rights issue as the right to be free of genocidal rapes in Burma. But it's very symbolic. What are they afraid of women driving? I think they're afraid that women will go somewhere and stay there. That's what I think. And that's how I view international law. I view international law as a 10-cylinder car for women. Puts them in the driver's seat and gets them somewhere. And that's where they stay. Women as peacemakers is a first step. Women have to be power possessors, or they're going to end up having to be peacemakers again. Peace does not end up with giving equality, and peace does not end up with changing patriarchal structures. We can change that. Now, how do we use the law to really make changes? I want to note that as we speak, they're drafting a new constitution in Egypt, and not one woman is on the Constitution Drafting Committee. I've been advising the women of South Sudan on their drafting of the Constitution, and I've repeatedly pointed out that they're asking for things they're already entitled to under the international law that Sudan adheres to and under the African Protocol. So everything they're fighting for as matters of policy, they're entitled to as matters of law. And that's sort of what the Global Justice Center, what I do. We want women to get law, not policy. I want to talk about women, peace, and security, and how the law is not working for women, not because it's not there, but because it's not enforced. We have a plethora of laws these days. International laws become a defining force with globalization. We have an international criminal court. We have a Security Council that's recognized protection of civilians is essential to its mandate under the UN Charter to secure peace. We have resolutions saying no impunity for sexual violence or rape as a war crime. We have resolutions ordering states to ensure equality during peace talks. Are these enforced? No. And I want to talk now about a lead in one of these issues that Norway has taken. I don't have to go into the fact that the deliberate use of rape as a tactic of war is horrifying and tragic. However, victims, women and girls, particularly girls under 18 who get pregnant because they're the most subject to abductions, they shouldn't be imposed to further torture and suffering by being forced to carry the pregnancy to term, to raise a raped child. And yet that's what's happening. In armed conflicts around the world, there's 23 of them, in humanitarian aid settings, victims who come for complete medical care and these are the sick and wounded under the Geneva Conventions, are being denied abortions. Norway is the first country that's spoken up on the rights of these victims who are war victims. They're wounded and sick under the Geneva Conventions, and Norway has said they're entitled to full, non-discriminatory medical care regardless of condition. They can't be singled out because they became pregnant from their war crimes, and they're entitled to this under Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. I worked with Norway on this. We've got a long ways to go, but I know other countries. 55 or more MPs just cited to Norway in wanting the UK to take aggressive steps both to ensure its humanitarian aid reached women and provided all care, not just childbirth kits for 15-year-olds who have been sex slaves. Over 3,000 groups cited to Norway, and they wrote to President Obama because of the U.S. ban on abortion in U.S. funds. Now, I have to add, it's not his fault. He inherited from President Bush tightening up of U.S. foreign aid by removing the fact that you used to be able to provide abortions when a woman's life was at risk or rape. Those were taken out, and that's the platform that Obama's been left with, but we're trying to encourage him to lift it, and Norway's been key to that. Second, another way the law can be used is that rape is being used as a tactic of war. Whether you call it a tactic or a weapon, they're both unlawful. the laws of war do two things. They help give the wounded and sick medical care, and you can see where women aren't getting their rights under that. And they also govern hostilities. Not every weapon is legal. Not every tactic is legal. And you don't need a special treaty to say this is an illegal weapon. For example, in Norway, they have a penal code that talks about unlawful weapons in international conflict, and they have one part of the penal code, 106, that talks about unlawful tactics, including starvation is an unlawful tactic, unlawful weapons like dum-dum bullets or missile heads or biological weapons or herbicides. So why is rape the single most used unlawful weapon in the world, and no state has been accountable for using an unlawful weapon? Not once. This would change the paradigm for women as far as access to justice, because they would be able to get justice for victims of an unlawful tactic or weapon, as well as for rape as a war crime or element of genocide. So one campaign that I'm embarked upon and that I think could change a lot is to have rape-using states be held accountable and have to pay reparations for using an unlawful weapon, that of rape. And that states could start doing something by listing the use of rape right after starvation as an unlawful tactic. Now, the fact that we don't treat rape as a weapon removes central protection from the laws of war to women. And it removes victims' rights to accountability for this particular crime, which is a separate crime. Now, also, we track battle deaths and we track injuries by weapons. So, because rape isn't considered a weapon, none of the global indices track how many women died from rape, are dying from rape every day. When you hear figures like 500,000 women have been raped in the DRC, those are survivors. Nobody knows how many women have been killed by rape, which happens on the battlefield. So we have made women invisible under the laws of war, in part due to the fact that rape isn't considered a weapon. Now, the other element of discrimination is the rampant delivery of the HIV virus through rape. Not all of it is deliberate. There are many infected soldiers. It's not deliberate. But there is credible evidence, the UN, other countries, that commanders have ordered HIV-infected soldiers to rape enemy women in order to infect them. That's use of a biological weapon. Nobody in any military will dispute me. The U.S. Army Manual says the delivery of the HIV virus during armed conflict deliberately to have a military aim is use of a biological weapon. The by any means. If you would charge someone for putting a syringe of HIV virus into the blood supply, why is it different if it's delivered via the penis? The third aspect of applying international law to conflict is looking at what happens when conflict winds up. Now, we heard miraculous 1976 peace accord agreements in Ireland. But what's missing for that story is that the Constitution that had to come out of forging peace gave up equality. Now, power in Northern Ireland is between two male-dominated religious parties. That's power sharing. What we have to do is go back to ceasefires. There are no women at ceasefires or at peace agreement talks, less than 1%. This means that they're not given the spoils or the division. It's always a quid pro quo. Plus, whoever is at those bodies becomes the basis of who sits at the Constitution bodies. One thing that has been a big world advance is that countries draw together something called multi-donor funds. billions of dollars to go into reconstruction, headed by the UN and the World Bank. Billions. Now, a lot of these funds are supposed to be for post-conflict, but they've gone to Sudan, they've gone to Iraq, and they've gone to the DRC during conflict. So a lot of that money ends up in the same hands that are the people who are still continuing in the wars. But I want to speak to one thing we can do about this. One element of this money is something called DDR. You might not have heard about it, but it's called demilitarization, demobilization, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Basically, it's giving money to rebel forces, to the people who rape, to young men, so that they'll have some cash, they'll get out of the army, they'll give up their gun, they'll get some job training. What happens to the women? 1% of that money is given for women to get jobs and empowerment. So you have men, and it's showing most of the men use that for self-consumer spending. Red motorcycles is a big item. So the men who may be rapists have red motorcycles. The women are staying home with their rape babies. Do you see anything wrong with that picture? Okay. Finally, we have to quit passing laws, and we have to quit having the UN pronounce ending impunity or seeing that people go to the ICC and actually doing it. Just 2 months ago, Secretary Ban Ki-moon made a historic report on women, peace, and security under 3 resolutions. I won't give you the numbers, it's kind of boring, but what he said was he was covering states that use sexual violence as a weapon. What did he do about Burma? Well, he didn't mention that the Burma Constitution gives complete and permanent amnesty for war crimes, including sexual violence. Even if Aung San Suu Kyi were president tomorrow, it's unconstitutional for her to try to bring the military into a civilian court. Ban Ki-moon knows about this because the U.S. Senate women have written him about this. The rapporteur for Burma has written him about this, Quintana in his report. But yet we still have politics prevailing over principle. And somehow the fact that amnesties exist, and he's reporting under statutes that say no amnesties ever for sexual violence, and there's not a word about it. That's the kind of international law that we have to enforce. We can't have Security Council resolutions calling for equal law for women under the laws of war and then not living up to it. We can't have the call for no amnesties for people who engage in rape as a weapon when we have the head of the United Nations supporting a constitution that gives explicit amnesties forever for people who continue this day, as we speak now, raping the Kachin, the Karen, the Shan, the Karenni women in Burma. Finally, I'd just like to conclude that the forces of security, the forces of equality, have a long ways to go, and they have many new tools. What we're fighting are the isms. We're fighting tribalism, we're fighting nationalism, we're fighting fundamentalism, all used to gain power. We have to fight those isms, of course, with feminism, which I think is underestimated as a tool. And I think the fact that we now have a panoply of international laws is something that also we can put to good use. You know, anytime a law passes unanimously, like all these laws for women passed unanimously, you know that they didn't really think they had to do something. All the Security Council resolutions passed unanimously. CEDAW, the Treaty for Women, is the most widely ratified. That's because people don't take it seriously. If it was climate change, there'd be debate. If it was invading Syria, there'd be debate. But somehow the laws for women passed. Well, now we have to hold people to that. I think it's up to us to not only forge ahead for women, peace, and security, but we have to make global justice a reality. Laws on paper don't help anyone. Laws on paper don't give justice. But together, we can bring the laws on paper to practice and deliver a world that truly has enforceable global justice. Thank you.